Councilwoman Shepherd, what would you like to do with Council Bill 736?
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to offer an amendment to Council Bill 736 on page 11.
Thank you. We need to put the bill on the floor first. Thank you. Councilman Lopez, will you please put Council Bill 736 on the floor?
Madam President, with all due respect, if you can have somebody who's a proponent of this bill make that motion, I would be grateful.
Councilwoman Robb, would you like to put Council Bill 736 on the floor?
Actually, never mind. I think I can do it.
Okay.
I apologize.
Go right ahead.
I move that Council Bill 736, 2000 of series of 2013 be placed upon final consideration and pass
as amended.
As amended.
Pass as amended. Thank you. It has been moved and seconded. Comments from Council. Councilwoman Shepherd, go ahead with your amendment.
Okay. I move to amend Council Bill 736 in the following particulars. On page 2, line 14, after the word location, strike the words on private, non-residential property. On page 2, line 16, after the word place, delete the quote, semicolon or, end quote, and insert, quote, period, end quote. On page 2, strike lines 17 through 19, deleting subsection C. On page 3, line 14, insert subsection D to read as follows. D, it shall not be an offense under subsection B of this section if the consumption of marijuana is occurring on private residential property and the person consuming the marijuana is, number 1, an owner of the property, or number 2, a person who has a leasehold interest in the property, or number 3, any other person who has been granted express or implied permission to consume marijuana on the property by the owner or the lessee of the property. Number 5, on page 3, line 25, strike D and insert E.
All right, that has been moved, and I need a second for the amendment. Second. It has been moved and seconded. Comments by members of council. Councilwoman Shepherd.
Yeah, I appreciate my colleague Councilwoman Fotz's humor a little bit earlier about the Groundhog Day status, so please indulge me, folks, while we have another Groundhog Day round on this, but this is too important not to bring up again. I've had a lot of heartburn since last week over the amended version that has been moving forward, and I feel that, and a lot of these I stated last week, but I think it bears repeating. I really feel that the ordinance that is moving forward today as amended overturns the will of the voters regarding Amendment 64. 66% of Denver voters did vote to support regulating marijuana like alcohol. The Councilwoman Robb's amendment, I feel, does infringe on private property rights and unfairly tries to claim that private property rights are public based on whether one can see onto that property or not from a public place. Also, I find it discriminatory because the ordinance as it currently stands will be unfair depending on the type of property that one has, and specifically whether A, you have a backyard, and B, it is surrounded by a privacy fence, or you have some other piece of your property that has a privacy fence. And for those who were following this discussion last week, we had a very enlightening conversation with Chief White about this because it is a civil infraction. It would be very, very difficult to enforce the bill as currently written, and I think everyone that pays attention knows that our emergency response times have been increasing quite a bit. This can only potentially add to that, and I'm especially concerned about what might happen in dispatch when dispatchers are trying to figure out, you know, what's a true emergency as opposed to someone saying that they think they saw someone smoking pot 30 minutes ago on their property. I know that we are doing something that has never been done before. And I do very, very much appreciate the tremendous amount of deliberation and thought that has gone into shaping all of our conversations to this point. But I know it's going to be nearly impossible to get everything right, but I think it is incumbent upon us to do our best to try to create legislation around the regulation of this that is fair to those concerned, honors private property rights, and doesn't endanger the police and emergency responses that we have to true emergencies in our city by tangling up our dispatch situation with people snitching on their neighbors. So that's why I'm offering this amendment today. I would very much ask my colleagues to consider this and support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Shepherd. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a question for David Broadwell. David, since this basically would negate the Robb amendment to Council Bill 736 and, in effect, rescinds that action, can you clarify how many votes we need for this amendment tonight to pass?
David Broadwell, Assistant City Attorney. All floor amendments require 7 votes for adoption.
So even though it essentially has the effect of rescinding, it doesn't require 9 votes?
Your rules make no distinction for an amendment that might have countermanded a prior amendment. All floor amendments require 7 votes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. Councilwoman Robb.
Thank you, Madam President. My question is also for David Broadwell. David, when we began this trip, so to speak, in committee, you went over sort of some precedent on public and open consumption, what the various amendments have said. And this week there was some email exchange, particularly regarding Councilwoman Kanish's question of last week about what does the Constitution really say. Could you please go over that a little bit and refresh our memory about Amendment 64, recreational marijuana, and also about Amendment 20, and any cross-reference in those?
Yes, thank you. What Councilwoman Robb is referring to is that the very beginning of this conversation back in early October, I gave a presentation to Council, a PowerPoint presentation, in which we talked about various policy options in terms of how you might go. I think during the course of the debate, we've hit every single option in terms of the various alternatives we talked about on day one. But one of the things we did in that presentation as well was to lay out for Council the fact that the voters in Denver have said yes to marijuana 5 times in 5 different ballot issues starting in the year 2000. And we pointed out how in each of those ballot questions, either in the ballot title or in the text of the measure itself, there was some representation of the fact that, dear voter, if you vote yes on this, you'll only be authorizing private or discrete consumption of marijuana, not consumption in public. But each time it was voted in those 5 instances, it was stated in a slightly different way. That none of the ballot issues kind of expressed that principle in quite the same words each time it came back and back. The conversation you're referring to that we had this week, we've particularly gone back and juxtaposed the language in Amendment 20, the original medical marijuana constitutional amendment in 2000, and the language in Amendment 64 just last year. And again, it's expressed differently. The concept of private consumption is expressed differently in each of those 2 amendments. So if you go back to the original medical marijuana amendment, you'll see that it says directly in the amendment, it says medical marijuana patients shall not consume medical marijuana in a public place or in plain view of the general public. So it's definitely expressed as an or, and it goes on to say that a medical marijuana patient who violates those provisions is subject to revocation of their red card for a period of 1 year by the State Department of Health. So a sanction against public consumption was actually written into the Constitution originally in the year 2000. Flash forward 12 years, and Amendment 64 treated the subject somewhat differently, and this is what I explained in response to Councilwoman Kanish's question last week. Amendment 64 kind of stated it in the opposite. It simply said, we're legalizing adult possession and consumption of an ounce or less of marijuana. However, nothing herein shall be deemed to allow open and public consumption. And as I explained last week, I infer from that language that we're still free as a city council, as a state legislature, to continue to regulate the aspects of open and public consumption and define what those terms mean. And that's what this discussion has been over the last 2 months, is to define it. So it really says something quite different in the medical marijuana initiative from 12 years ago versus what the voters said they wanted last year. And I think that's the clarification you were seeking.
I think the other thing is where the reference in Amendment 64 to the Amendment 20.
Correct. Amendment 64 goes on to say that nothing in the new so-called recreational marijuana provisions of Amendment 64 was intended to repeal anything about Amendment 20. And in fact, there's language in Amendment 64 that says the State Department of Public Health and Environment is expected to continue to administer medical marijuana regulations the same now as they were before the adoption of Amendment 64. So it adopted all these new provisions for retail or recreational marijuana, but purported to keep intact all the old medical marijuana provisions. Welcome to my world.
Thank you, Madam President. I will have some comments later. I just have one other question for Mr. Broadwell.
Go ahead.
And that question is more down in the weeds, pardon the pun, but in the amendment as I brought it forward last week, was there anything about privacy fences, or how could people be outside on their property, not observable from a street or sidewalk? Could you clarify that a little bit, just the meaning of observable? And
that would be fact-specific depending on the property, and there would be a requirement for the police to have probable cause and for prosecutors to show that it was in fact observable. And if there was, if the view from the public street or sidewalk toward the property was obscured in some way, and the person were outside but behind a screen, behind vegetation, behind a fence or whatever, it wouldn't be an actionable offense. It wouldn't be unlawful the way your original amendment was written.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Robb. Councilwoman Kanish.
Thank you, Madam President. I seconded this motion tonight in part because I've had some change of heart. Last week, when we debated this amendment, I voted against it, the Robb amendment, this interesting limitation of use where it's visible, but not where it's not visible. And I then went ahead and voted for the final bill, saying that, I thought it was, I didn't support the amendment, but I still wanted to support the overall regulatory framework that was in place. It was a long holiday weekend, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And no legislation is perfect. That is true. But I really questioned whether in good conscience I could continue to support a bill that I felt we openly acknowledged in this chamber was unlikely to be enforced. And I also didn't know that I could support a bill that was about legislating the personal preferences of some not to be exposed to something they found offensive and potentially harmful. It is my standard that people shouldn't smoke in front of children. It's my standard that people shouldn't smoke marijuana near schools. They shouldn't, be having parties on their front lawn smoking marijuana. That's my personal standard. But I can't, in good conscience, support an unenforceable law that will be applied to the citizens of Denver based on my personal standards. And so I support Councilwoman Shepherd's amendment tonight. And I share with my colleagues that if it were not to pass, I could not support this bill again on second reading after further consideration. It is not enforceable by our own admission, and it is intended to establish a standard that is indeed personal and not public in its protection. and it is unevenly applied based on what kind of property you live on, which is not a principle that I can stand for. So I urge my colleagues to support Councilwoman Shepherd's amendment, and should it fail, I would urge my colleagues to vote against this bill as the wrong step. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kanish. Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam President. I, too, will be voting for this amendment, and I could not support the bill without this amendment passing for the same reasons. I mean, a lot of echo of what my colleague, Councilman Kanish, had said. But, my position on this, I think a lot of the folks that I've come into contact with, both in my district and around the city, and seen some email come in, I wasn't here for the first reading. I was at the Emergency Management and Disaster Preparedness Training. But I was paying attention to what was going on. Tonight, I'll say this, and I said this in committee, I think it's one thing to be able to say, I don't want to smell or have smoke or be around marijuana smoke in a public park while I'm celebrating my daughter's 7th birthday. Right? I don't want that. I don't think that should be an appropriate space. I don't think a street sidewalk should be an appropriate place. I don't think a patio on 16th Street Mall or Federal Boulevard or 32nd Avenue should be an appropriate place. But I also, at the same time, don't think that it should be wrong for somebody to use on their own property. If we pass this bill without the amendment, making it illegal for someone to smoke on their front porch or patio, some folks don't have backyards. That means they're going inside to smoke. And if they have children inside, they're going to be smoking inside. The one thing I appreciate about a smoker, whether it's marijuana or cigarettes, is that if there's children inside, they choose whether to smoke inside or outside, and they have the choice to smoke outside. If we don't pass this amendment, they're going to be forced to smoke inside. Right? So I think in the same breath, as much as I totally understand what folks are saying on the flip side, that's one of the most important things for us. The second is that we just approved through the budget and graduated new officers to hit our streets, to increase response call times in our city. That's a huge issue no matter what neighborhood you're in. We want them to respond to the real deal crimes and calls. I'd rather them to respond to a shooting or shots fired or an emergency as fast as they can over showing up to somebody's front yard and saying, put that out before I get my squirt gun out. Not that they have a squirt gun, but before I put it out myself. I want our officers' time spent on real crime. They've already told us, and the citizens have already told us, that they want this the lowest enforcement priority. We have to respect that. You've heard from the chief that this is not something that they're going to be code 10 to or lights on and going after. We had a shooting over the weekend that really stirred me up. And there's a lot of these going on. I'd rather those officers respond to that. The last thing is the fact that we don't regulate an outdoor ban on somebody having a barbecue with beers in their front yard or smoking cigarettes in their front yard. However offensive that odor may be, I do not like cigarette smoke. I really do not like it. It really bothers me. We know how dangerous it is. But we don't have a law regulating you can't smoke on your front porch. So given that, I do understand the intent of going forward with it without it, but I could not vote for this bill without this amendment. And so tonight, I'm going to support Councilman Shepherd's amendment, and I look forward to talking about a 1,000-foot buffer from schools in the committee meeting, which I support. So that be it. Thank you, Madam President, for letting me speak.
Thank you, Councilman Lopez. Councilman Brooks.
Thank you, Madam President. And I just want to thank Councilwoman Robb just for working so hard on this amendment. You know, oftentimes it's easy to be the critic and a lot tougher to be in the arena. This is a tough issue, and I think there's important and good points on both sides of this issue. I think, I was laughing as Councilwoman Kanish was talking because I think one thing I've learned from this is I'll never bring a bill forth when there's a big break like this because it gives you a lot of time to think. And unfortunately, during my break, when I was with my kids, I got a lot of phone calls. And some of those phone calls were from leaders in my community who made some very good points about this bill and why it'd be harmful to the neighborhood, the very neighborhood that I was trying to protect. And these neighborhood leaders are in leadership positions in their neighborhoods within my district. So two big issues for me on this bill. One, I'm the chair of Health, Safety, Education Services Committee, and I am required in tasks, our committee's required in tasks to make sure that DPD is responding appropriately and they're getting the resources that they need. Well, the fact is we aren't responding the way we need to, which you've heard today, and that's because they don't have the resources they need. But because of 2A and other budget measures, they're starting to get some. Where am I going with this? A lot of folks up here have talked about that need and that issue of saying, hey, how are we going to attend to this need? We're putting a bill forward and we're beginning to say we're going to address this issue of smoking in your front yard. And it's setting a false expectation up because we're not going to address this issue. We don't have the resources to do it. That's just plain and incorrect. And I was struggling with that last week. But it's clear we do not have the resources to do it. And so it's setting up a false expectation for our community. If we're going to pass this bill, at least we need to have kind of the resources to enforce it. The other piece for me is that because of all the issues that are going on that I talked about last week around some of our licensed marijuana shops and our dispensaries and centers, our focus should be on regulations there, not regulations in our neighborhoods and in private homes. And so that's one of the conclusions that I came up to. I think lastly, someone shared with me a quote that I actually said at the Cherry Creek rezoning, and I just said something to the effect of, our cities are not static. They're vibrant and dynamic. They're constantly growing and they're constantly changing. And I think fear sometimes causes us to protect and not allow our cities to grow and be dynamic. And so because of those things, I am changing my vote today, and I'm going to be supporting the Shepherd Amendment. But I want to say one thing that I hope that we in the city and neighbors can respect each other. Respect if there is some issues within the neighborhood. If someone is smoking out and there's a couple of folks and it is impeding on your neighbor's yard and in front yard, I hope that you can respect and have a decent conversation. But the bill that we have in front of us with the Robb Amendment, I think causes neighbors to come against each other rather than come together. So I'll be supporting the Shepherd bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Brooks. Councilwoman Robb.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm just going to do a little bit of review with the amendment that I proposed last week. I was trying to balance the rights of people who consume marijuana and the rights of those in the same neighborhoods who want to enjoy the use of their private property. And I agree it's a fine line, and that's why council seems to be teetering, swaying back and forth on this tightrope of public policy. I thought we had found the balance last week, but I do think it's a very important discussion, and I honor that. While a lot of the form opposition letters that we got over the long weekend talked about property rights, and indeed that's an issue, I will remind people that we do regulate public property in a lot of ways. You can't disturb the peace of your neighbor on public property. You can't just let your grass grow, again, no pun intended, to all heights. And as you heard tonight, Amendment 20 that regulates medical marijuana, when it was passed, and today, according to Amendment 64, says medical marijuana patients can lose a card for smoking in plain view of the public. I personally think it's absurd for the consumption of medical marijuana by patients who have reportedly a debilitating medical condition to be regulated more strictly than recreational users and on that private property. Maybe the solution is not the, quote, Robb amendment, but we know how hard it is to change the Constitution. And I would put forward that voters could have naively believed that being able to set open and public definitions or definitions of open and public might be based on other laws that had come forward. I appreciate very much what Councilman Brooks said about where we need to go, however this comes out, because I do think the message, however we regulate or enforce it, is that the public expects some discretion in how marijuana is used in plain view of other people. But I really want to challenge actually the Jesus Committee, the Health Safety Committee, because I am very disturbed by what I am hearing that we are setting false expectations for enforcement. You may not agree with enforcement in public view on private property, but if I am hearing that our rules on the 16th Street Mall, on the sidewalk in front of my house, or on the street in front of my house, or on a patio on 32nd Avenue can't be enforced and we shouldn't expect it, I don't know what we've been spending our time on. I actually give the Chief of Police some credit on this. I think he was saying that we want to come to compliance, something I agreed with, that we don't want a criminal offense. He was saying we won't go into people's houses. That's true. But I expect enforcement on what we do put in place. No, it's not the highest priority. Disturbing the peace and calling the police at midnight because your neighbor's college kids are drinking and shouting in the yard is not the highest priority if there's a shooting going on anywhere in the city. Even, you know, and I guess I'll just add one other thing. I agree we have more police coming on. I hope all response times, whatever the call is, improve. But this council also amended on the floor the tax for marijuana, saying we don't know what it would be used for. And I really want to be sure that in whatever we define public and open consumption, that this council expects enforcement. Not over life-threatening crimes, but we inspect enforcement as we do with violating the speed limit. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Robb. Councilwoman Fotz.
Thank you, Madam President. Obviously, I can see the writing on the wall here, but I do want to say that I'm going to continue to support the Robb Amendment and oppose the Shepherd Amendment. We often hear this, well, Denver approved this amendment, 64, by 66%. Not my area. My area was very close. When Councilman Brown brought the statistics, it showed 52% in my area. And what were they thinking? What aspect of marijuana were they approving, even that 52%? From conversations I've had with them, It seems to me the prevailing feeling of many of the people who supported it was to decriminalize marijuana. They saw no reason to have jails be full of people who were smoking marijuana, or to even put that as a burden on the people. But I do believe they fully expected for the consumption to be private and discreet. And for that reason, I believe that's what the Robb Amendment tried to accomplish. I still think it's the best public policy, and I'm going to stick with it.
Thank you, Councilwoman Fox. Councilman Lopez.
Thank you, Madam President. I got a question for Mr. Broadwell, actually. Mr. Broadwell, if somebody is smoking in plain view inside their house and you can see through their window, they're inside their house, but the person who's offended can see them smoking in their house because of the wind, by looking through the window. Would that fall under, would that be a crime?
No, the current version of the bill with the Robb Amendment only applies to outdoor consumption on residential property.
I wanted to make sure that was clear for folks. Thank you.
Actually, I have a question about that too for Mr. Broadwell. Did the council, I wasn't on council at the time when Amendment 20, did the council define public and in plain view at the time for Amendment 20?
No, there was no conversation at that point. Again, I'll remind everybody, after Amendment 20 passed, we went many years with only a handful of card-carrying patients in Colorado. So the population of people affected by Amendment 20 was very, very small for until the explosion in 2009.
So it wouldn't have been against the law for them to smoke on their front porch?
Yeah, the point I was making earlier is that unlike the answer I gave to Councilwoman Knish last week, you recall she asked me whether Amendment 64 itself expressly criminalized open and public consumption, and I said it didn't. It just says it doesn't condone open and public, but it doesn't criminalize it. But the point I made a few moments ago was to say it's quite different in Amendment 20, where it actually contained the offense in the Constitution and said that consumption of medical marijuana in plain view of the general public can result in getting your red card revoked by the state health authorities. So the sanction was right in Amendment 20, and that perhaps is another answer to your question. Frankly, we didn't even think about it. We didn't look at it, but it was quite a different situation where there was a contemplated sanction, and it wasn't a criminal sanction. It was loss of your patient privileges, is what the authors of Amendment 20 wrote into that provision.
Does the Robb Amendment affect medical marijuana users? That is, I mean, would they still be able to smoke on their front porch, but the recreational user not? I mean, does that amendment even apply to Amendment 20?
Well, the current state of the bill, and including the Robb Amendment, makes no distinction about whether the user is a patient or whether the user is just someone 21 years or older. It purports to prohibit the same conduct and have the same safe harbors or defenses, so it sort of applies equally to all. But with medical marijuana, there is this overlay of this constitutional provision from 2000, which is still there, and creates another potential sanction that patients ought to be aware of. To the best of my knowledge, the state health authorities have never enforced it, but it is there. It's a part of our state constitution.
But it's never been defined, the plain view or public from Amendment 20, correct?
Correct. It just says plain view of the general public is something that could get your card revoked.
Yeah, I think that's another confusion area for these for that amendment. All right, I'm going to go to Councilwoman Knish.
Thank you, Madam President. I just wanted to pick up where you left off because I'm nervous that this conversation will leave folks under the impression that our police would have the authority to stop or somehow cite a medical marijuana user in violation of the state constitution. So I think what we need you to clarify, Mr. Broadwell, is do Denver police have the authority to enforce Amendment 20's prohibition?
I thought I was clear before. That sanction is invoked by the state health authorities as a part of their administering the patient registrations. So it's an administrative thing that would be done by them. That's what the language of Amendment 20 expressly provided.
Right. So I'm just taking that to its next, if I may, Madam President, comment, to its next logical conclusion, which is that we are not, if we were to pass Councilwoman Shepherd's amendment and go back to the original version of this bill, we are not creating two different standards in the city and county of Denver. What happens between medical marijuana users and the medical marijuana regulatory scheme in terms of their red cards has always been a creature of state law and not of local law, and it will continue to be a creature of state law. We are simply giving direction to our public safety officials and our residents in terms of the expectations. And so because I'm afraid this conversation might leave folks confused, I felt like that required a little underlining before we voted. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Kanish. Councilwoman Ortega.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to indicate why I am going to be voting against this amendment tonight. After Amendment 64 passed and we started getting approached by people from the industry, I was asked, I can't speak for any of the rest of you, to approve the same regulations and to be able to allow the existing operators to sell their product as recreational. And then we went through the whole conversation about whether we were going to allow them to co-locate or have a real separation versus a virtual separation. And we went way beyond what I was originally asked for to support in terms of allowing the existence as well as the regulatory framework to be consistent with medical marijuana. And as I said last week, we have just opened the doors wide open to things beyond what was originally requested. And I believe there are so many unknowns that we're going to be dealing with over a course of time. And one of the primary ones is the social costs, both to people as well as the financial burden that may be imposed on the city of Denver. And I believe that it is our responsibility to be more restrictive, and then we can come back and look at where we want to make changes, because it will be far easier to loosen things than it is to take those floodgates and try to close them at some point in time later. And so that is why I will not be supporting this amendment tonight. I supported the Robb amendment. As you know, we'll have a discussion next week about trying to create some spacing and have that buffer from schools so that we continue to do our part in protecting children. And so just wanted to state why I am not voting for this tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ortega. All right, let's have a roll call vote. And we are voting on the amendment, the Shepherd Amendment.
Shepherd?
Aye.
Brooks?
Aye.
Brown?
Aye.
Fox?
No.
Herndon?
No.
Kanish? Aye. Lehman?
No.
Lopez?
Aye.
Montero?
No.
Nevitt?
Aye.
Ortega?
No.
Robb?
No.
Madam President?
Aye. Madam Secretary, close the voting, announce the results.
7 ayes, 6 nays.
7 ayes, 6 nays. The Shepherd Amendment does pass.